The Broken Violin by Owen Kortz, narrated by the author. Shel's phone alarm went off at 7:38 a.m., and she tapped snooze for the fourth time, a pattern she'd fallen into over the past few weeks since her near drowning. Her floral comforter lay ruffled at a diagonal across the mattress, mocking her for still being in bed. She'd had the dream about the broken violin again, her grandparents' harrowing stares boring into her, and the splintered instrument she still held, not knowing what they wanted or what to do to put the pieces back together. This time the dream ended with her screaming and shaking the violin. She was a zombie walking down the hallway to the shower with her hair jutting in random directions. Showering and putting on makeup, she felt like she was watching herself from beyond her body. Two girls were a few sinks down from her in the bathroom, one dressed for the day in capri pants and a low-cut t-shirt, the other in black tights and a white sweater that hung off her shoulder. They were brushing their hair, applying mascara, and talking about some other girl they both despised. Their indifference to Shel's presence confirmed her fear that she was a void. Why hadn't her war with the ocean been able to make things right again? She was living someone else's story, not the one she imagined for herself. Back in her room, she put on jeans and flipped through her pile of t-shirts. She found one that she'd begged her parents to buy her in 7th grade, of Einstein with an old video camera superimposed against his eye and an equation beneath reading E equals m sine squared. She hadn't worn it in years and wondered now why she'd brought it to college. She picked out a black top and pulled it over her head. Scanning through her phone, the recent calls screen was open, and she saw the 415 area code number she'd called last week for the San Francisco Police Department. They'd said they didn't have a name on file for the caller who found her at the beach. He'd slipped away shortly after the paramedics arrived, before they had time to question him. She clicked her phone off and looked at the blank screen before putting it in her pocket. The crisp, early February wind refreshed Shel on the walk to the music building, Morrison Hall. The milieu passed by in her periphery like the gentle fog of the morning, which the pine trees held onto, not wanting to release it in exchange for the daytime sun. Morrison was a beige brick building, unimpressive in comparison with the pillared giant Wheeler, but it was welcoming and without pretense. Music appreciation class, the only elective left that would fit her schedule after she registered for her other classes, was not her favorite. The professor, Mr. Tarlet, had plodded through 2 weeks of Gregorian chant and modern performances of ancient songs for lute. Shel didn't see how any of this would relate to her making films, if she even wanted to make films anymore. All she really felt like doing was sleeping. The classroom was nothing fancy. It felt like a high school room with squeaky plastic chairs connected to flip desks, an outdated tile floor of orange and off-white, and a sliding chalkboard. It had been updated with a newer sound system and speakers, however, which may have replaced the tape deck, Shel thought. She was 2 minutes late to class, but shuffled in and found her usual seat. It wasn't assigned, but most of the students locked in on a spot in the classroom and didn't waver. Charlie was already there, and Shel sat next to him. "Good morning," he whispered. "Yeah, it's all right." She meant it with gravity, but with Charlie's stare she couldn't hide a slight smile, and then shook her head. Mr. Tarlet, an older man Shel thought in his mid-60s, had unruly white-gray hair and bushy eyebrows, which often rose above his thick glasses. He almost always wore denim shirts and a fleece jacket, which rounded over his slight potbelly where it met his loose-hanging trousers. He had just queued up the first listening of the day, and everyone was awaiting the highfalutin voice of an Italian castrato at the syllabus's cue. Instead, a piano playing open-sounding chords along with a low thudding came through the speakers. Shel lifted her head. The low instrument plucked a short melody, which was then followed by a long and short note from the piano, and what sounded like horns, maybe a trumpet. The tones were warm, but had a dry edge that felt to Shel like guileless words. The trumpet took over the melody and played as if the phrases were already in the air, and it was simply pointing out what had already existed. The song, the sounds, pressed their palms into her heart. They spoke to her of what she was experiencing and understood and lightened the burden. As the trumpet solo ended, Mr. Tarlet slowly turned the volume knob, fading out the track. Shel looked blankly at him, awaiting an explanation for this departure from the expected. "Miles Davis," he said, more to himself than the class. You know, I've been teaching this class for almost 20 years, and something hit me last night while I was listening to this song that had never occurred to me before. Shel looked around and saw the other students staring at him. I've always taught this class as an appreciation for the musicians who created the music and for the importance of the concepts or techniques that certain composers or performers introduced into the annals of music history. Wasn't that what a music appreciation class was supposed to be about, Shel thought? But I've never taught an appreciation for what music is. He paused for a long time, his white eyebrows peeking over his glasses and his hands extending toward the class, as if everyone was in on this revelation. A guy in the front shifted in his chair. Shel and Charlie exchanged a brief glance. Shel sensed a difference in Mr. Tarlay today, though, his voice more sonorous and his eyes embers. Before he droned on, but today his vigor belied his age. "Look," he stumbled for words, "how did this music make you feel?" Silence. "I mean, not even feel as in emotions, but what did it feel like in your body, moving through you?" "Kinda jazzy?" A guy on the far left of the classroom flung this response, maybe hoping to bring Mr. Tarlay back to the measured world of antiquity to 1750. Mr. Tarlay smiled and reset, seeming to become aware of his intensity but not letting go his point. "Okay, it's a start." He motioned toward the student. "Thank you, Ross. Anyone else?" A girl with dark braids in the front row raised her hand. "It felt kind of like it cut through, not in a harsh way, but just direct." "Good, Imani." "It swung, made me feel more relaxed," another student said from just behind Shel. Mr. Tarlay gathered air with his hands. "It cut through, it was direct, made you feel more relaxed." He paused. "Why do you think it affects you that way?" Silence again. He turned back to his computer and clicked on another song. Immediately Shel recognized the iconic electric guitar motif, but wasn't sure what the song was called. The drums thundered and distorted guitars layered to set up an ominous cloud for the singer's grit to stab through. After the lyric, "I'm off to Never Never Land," the guitar became a demon with flourishing, screeching wails. Mr. Tarlay eased the volume knob down again. "How do you feel now?" "Agitated. Angry. Pumped up," answers flew from around the room. Mr. Tarlay held out one hand to his left. "Relaxed, direct." Then he held out his right hand. "Agitated, angry, pumped up." He dropped both hands. "Why?" "It's the vibe," said a student from the back. Mr. Tarlay pointed where the voice had come from behind Shel, jumped towards the blackboard, and wrote, "Music is vibration." "But what causes different kinds of vibrations? Why do we feel relaxed listening to one song and angry listening to another?" Shel noticed her grip had tightened on her desk, and she relaxed, trying to follow the stream of ideas. She couldn't get over the drastic charge of enthusiasm and energy Mr. Tarlay suddenly had and wondered what caused it. It certainly made class more interesting, but she couldn't help but think it was a little over the top. Was she weird for not wanting to jump into this new direction? She looked around again and saw that a few students were on their laptops, checking email or scanning posts, but Imani and Charlie, Ross in the front row, and a couple others were homed in on Mr. Tarlay. "Listen to this." He clicked another clip on his monitor. A Native American flute flowed gently into their ears. Shel sensed a tingle along her spine. He went to the board again and drew a wavy line. "This is what the waveform looks like for a flute. You can imagine those vibrations undulating our eardrums. What do you notice about it?" "It has a pattern," Charlie said, dipping his head. "Good, and how about this one?" Mr. Tarlay continued. This time a loud cymbal crash surprised everyone and repeated a few times, biting into the classroom walls. A few students covered their ears. He made another illustration on the board. "Here's what the cymbal waveform looks like." His eyebrows rose again and he peered at the class over the rims of his glasses. "So why do these songs affect us differently?" Imani said, "Because one has nicer waveforms and the other more erratic ones?" "Yes," Mr. Tarlay said, "and why are we affected by those waveforms?" "Because they hit our ears?" Imani tried again. "True," he said, "but there's more. Think quantum physics, Einstein." He rapped the desk with his knuckles. "What do those high-powered microscopes show that this table is made of?" The guy behind Shel said, "Electrons, protons." "That's right, and what are those electrons and protons doing all the time?" He tapped all his fingers on the tabletop. Shel noticed a few of the students look up from their laptops. "Vibrating," Charlie said. "Exactly," Mr. Tarlay pointed at him. "So why are we affected by these waveforms?" Shel spoke up. "Because we are waveforms." "Bravo," he said, pausing a moment as if recognizing Shel anew. Then he went to the board again and began to make concentric circles. But remember, waveforms aren't linear like I've drawn them over there. They expand in all directions. Shel snapped into a flashback. In her mind's eye, she was running out into the ocean again, struggling against its current, grasping for breath. She went under, and her lungs seethed for air. So that's it, she remembered thinking, and her thoughts stopped, and all went dark. But then her awareness returned. She saw her body drifting there in the water, as if she was above it. There were no words, just silent knowing. A gentle wave of vibration, deeper and more peaceful than anything she'd ever felt, echoed on the horizon of her awareness. She found its center at the core of her heart, which melted in awe as rings of luminous golden waves undulated outward. She followed them as her sense of self expanded into the water, the vast sky, and out into the universe. All planets and stars, light and shadow, tension and resolution melted in that golden light, resounding with the most intimate and overwhelming harmony she'd ever felt. Time extended into infinity, and she didn't ever want to leave. Something like words, but not spoken, unfolded in her, communicating on a deeper level than words could express. The meaning began to reveal itself again. Shel gasped and then exhaled, steadying herself and her desk back in the classroom. Charlie turned to her. "You okay?" he whispered. She nodded, looking straight ahead. Mr. Tarley continued on about vibrations and the power of music to affect the way people feel. For a few moments, Shel felt like she was in an echo chamber, distanced from what she was hearing, and from her body sitting there in the classroom. But she settled in, and Mr. Tarley's next words caught her attention. "So if music has this power to affect us, what about our and others' actions, words, and even thoughts?" A tableau of events and feelings from the last few months dominoed through Shel's mind. It was true, her choices, Jeremy's choices, their words, her thoughts, were so powerful that at times they were a knife cutting into her heart. Mr. Tarley went on, "Because what are actions, words, and thoughts?" Finally, Charlie said, "Well, they're all different kinds of vibration, too. Action is movement. Words are wavelengths of sound forming words. Thoughts are synapses firing in the brain." "Exactly," Mr. Tarley sobered, looking at Charlie. "Action, words, and thoughts are all a kind of music." He paused and turned his head toward the floor. "Look," he picked up again, "what I'm trying to say is that I think we have a tendency, I certainly do, to relegate music to old, dead composers, to Spotify playlists and Muzak in the grocery store. It's something we study, we listen to for entertainment, and put back on the shelf when we're done. But music is a living, breathing thing that not only affects the way we feel, but it is us. We are the music. We are creating our own compositions around us all the time." "All right," he said. "I want to end today by paraphrasing one of my favorite quotes by philosopher Alan Watts. Life is a musical thing. Sing and dance while the music is being played." Sing and dance. Shel thought about what college had become. She wanted to sing and dance, but all she could hear was static.